And now here's part 2 of our episode.
Okay, now, Lindsay, would you tell us why is God Save the Queen the standout track from this album?
So I ended up choosing this song because I thought that within an album that does a really good job at like touching on themes of inequality here and there, God Save the Queen is really where it all comes to a head, because there's obviously no greater microcosm of inequality in British society than the existence of that family. And
Yes.
I'm convinced that so many of the UK's problems would be solved if we just stopped giving them money. Like, they do not need it at all. And yet, like, for everyone who pays taxes, like, that's what it goes towards. And it's infuriating because in many ways, the Sex Pistols England is very much the England of today. The economy is in tatters. There's a very prolonged housing crisis, all of the things. And as a result, there are many like good working people who do everything right on paper and yet are still not able to make ends meet because of the way things are. But no, let's not help them. Let's keep funneling money to protecting Prince Andrew. It's like, it's absolutely like
In particular.
Exactly. Among literally everything,
Yeah.
him. It's just like, oh God.
Goodness.
And it's, I think, very symptomatic of an issue that has always persisted in British culture, which is protecting a privileged few at the expense of the many. And I think that was something that was alive and well here, certainly long before the song was written, obviously at the time the song was written, today. And I think unless radical change happens, it'll always persist in the future. And so I think that song, particularly like the No Future refrain, is sort of like a timeless warning that the UK has never really heeded or paid attention to. And since the message of that song endures so heavily into the present day and likely beyond, that's kind of why I chose that one as a standout.
I mean, the lyrics of this, like, I mean, this is bold. I mean, I'm looking at the second stanza, God save the Queen, she's not a human being, and there's no future, and England's dreaming. I mean, I love a good direct lyric that like punches right at the heart of what's going on there. But even I was sort of like, wow, that is bold.
It really said that.
Yeah.
They really freaking said that. She really, I mean, obviously there's all the reptilian conspiracy theories, which you can put as much credence into as you want to. But I don't think that they're talking about, like, not mincing words is something that this strain of punk does with like such incredible power, and kind of like you can see the it's not that it's simple either. You know, like it doesn't feel like it's reductive in a way. It feels like it is like sort of all encompassing as a lyric, which I think maybe if I hear criticism of this era of punk music, like the kind of like origins of punk, it's that it's oversimplified in some ways. And you can credit that to the kind of idea about these people not being quote unquote very good musicians or whatever you want, which I think is not necessarily true at all. But do you see, I don't know how you feel about kind of like the idea of reductiveness in punk versus its ability to be kind of universal, this is a theme we talk about a fair amount. What are your thoughts on that, Lindsay?
Yeah, I definitely think, because you're right, it is very like simple, straightforward. And while that has been like weaponized against them in bands like them who kind of take a similar approach in their songwriting, I think that's like where the art and the talent lies. The fact that they are able to be so brief and curt, but have that make such an impact. I think that is kind of where it like gets its juice. And I think if you look at like the time that a lot of these bands were first coming out, which was like mid to late 70s, early 80s, that was a time where we were not seeing that type of songwriting, really. It was a lot of kind of like flowery language about, I don't know, I think the song I always use to like as a default to juxtapose like punk bands is like Summer Love Sensation by the Bay City Rollers, which is like, take a girl down to the beach and look at her hair, oh, and it's bright and lovely. And it's just a lot of like utter nonsense about the fact that you're like with a girl in the summer. Like, we get it. And so I think that a lot of a lot of sort of like the impact that it made also came because it was at a time when that was very much sort of not in vogue in terms of like how songs were being written.
That sort of like structured complexity kind of thing was what they were reacting against, I guess.
Yeah, kind of, because I guess like especially with like the hyper produced like Top of the Pops pop that was like so prevalent at the time, that obviously took effort to create. And so I think there was definitely like an upset that a band who seemingly wasn't putting in the same degree of effort was having success. I think that was kind of like a bit of like the pushback, but also I think that's why they were so successful. The fact that they didn't have to do all those things, but still found success and sort of like paved the way for the remaining sort of like versions and offshoots of punk that came to be over the course of like the past few decades.
It's just crazy that you can say this stuff on Twitter now, like the internet's such an insane thing, because like stuff like this being said in a public forum was such a big deal back then. And now you go on Twitter and you see the most horrendous, I guess it's called X now, but I refuse to call it X. That you go on Twitter now and you just see these sort of like vile language, just the worst things that could come out of a human, and it's just normal now, right? It's so interesting how normalized it has become, but you can see that it cost more to say this kind of thing in that era than it does to say these kind of things now. I think it is something that really struck me digging into the history of it.
So, Lindsay, do you see the Sex Pistols as the originators of punk? Because I mean, and this is maybe a controversial question, because I mean, the Ramones technically released an album before Sex Pistols did, but also like the Sex Pistols were buddies with Vivienne Westwood, and like, I mean, they in some ways they're the ones who kind of defined the aesthetic. So, you as the scholar of punk, like, is this where it all begins?
Okay, it's so interesting because I actually wrote an article for Consequence about this. I basically think that because it's hard to define like when genres begin and end because they obviously like bleed into each other. But if a line has to be drawn, which I think it does for the sake of defining eras, the Ramones did release the first punk album. That was in, I think, April 1976. But then in the UK, the Damned released the first punk single, and that was New Rose, which I believe is like October, November 1976. So sonically, were the Sex Pistols the first to do it? I would argue no. But I think what they were the first to do was to kind of like take the ethos of punk and make it what it is. They were the ones to make it a bit dangerous in a good way, in the way that the Ramones and the Damned didn't do, at least at that time. Because if you look at like what the Ramones and the Damned were singing about, the Damned's first single, or the first punk single in the UK, was New Rose, and that's just about like love. And a lot of the Ramones songs were about like being dumped, or like something like that, or girls or whatever. So it wasn't about
their allowance
anything
today.
So it wasn't about anything like subversive. It was very digestible material. The Sex Pistols changed that, and I think they kind of gave it that credo that punk came to be known as, which is that it was something that made you a little uncomfortable, but also like you couldn't look away. You felt like entranced by it, but you didn't know why, and it was a bit grotesque, but that was what did it for you. And it created that whole sensation, and it made it okay for punk to be a bit nasty and a bit unpalatable, but that didn't mean it wasn't what people needed, and it didn't mean that it wasn't what people wanted. So I think they took it to what it is, but I don't think they like started it full stop.
Nice, well said. They made it political. Like they took the sound and they gave the movement its political bent.
Yes.
Oh, cool. That is cool. I'm geeking about that one. Sorry. Wow. I mean, it's just interesting to think about sort of intellectual and aesthetic and artistic movements, and at what point in like kind of the wave building up steam, at what point it has to really codify its underlying ethos. And I love that you're like, as the waves kind of cresting, is kind of feels like what's happening there. That's wild. Okay, let's talk about standards for perfection, though. and I love how this ties into our talk about punk in general. But we asked you to nominate 4 albums that you believed were quote unquote perfect, and we didn't define that for you. So tell us, when you decided on these albums that you shared with us, what were the standards you were using to assess them, if you will?
Yeah, so I wanted to pick an album that like I liked, that I thought sounded good, that I thought was like well made, one that I could listen to for ages and never get tired of. Like I would skip almost no songs on the album. But I also wanted to pick something that was a bit subversive in its own way, in its own time, in whatever that looked like for the band in the era it was released. And also an album that like endured in its own way as well. But yeah, I was looking for something that I thought was great, but also kind of like made people a little uncomfortable in a good way, or like ruffled feathers, or brought about change, or did something different in some way. So that was my criteria.
Cool. That's a good one.
I don't think we've ever heard anyone talk about subversiveness as a quality for
No, I don't think so.
An album's perfection. I mean, is that, and I'm sort of thinking back on the albums you sent us, and I think that that does scan.
Yeah. There's something about it, looking at these albums contextually, right, is kind of, it always comes, when we ask this question, it always comes down to that, right? It's either in the context of the self, like the role it plays in the person's story, or it's like in the context of their sort of like general sense of taste and the other music that they were listening to, and how it sort of defines that part of their musical taste. But no, I think looking at things in their political context and them burnishing a period of time, or their role in defining an era of time, is not something we've talked about at all. So I think it's we probably will do that more as time goes on. I would have to think. I'm trying to think if there were any like other really sort of like political albums that people have nominated. I don't think so yet.
Yeah, I can't think of any specifically. I mean, we haven't covered a lot of the 60s albums, and I feel like if we get a few more of those in there, they might do a similar thing.
Yeah.
Granted, a very different sound profile.
Yeah.
So my hard question for this episode, I guess, is how do you justify violence? Because let's be real, Sid Vicious was a violent, granted, he was a drug addicted person and had lots of, I'm sure by today's standards, mental health issues that he seems to be going through. But this is a band that I don't know if I would say they advocated for violence, but it feels like they kind of did in some ways, and their shows could be very dangerous. Like, at one concert I read, like I think Sid Vicious threw like a glass bottle out into the audience, and it permanently blinded a woman who was at the show. And it sort of feels like the attitude is like, yeah, well, that's what happens when you're starting a revolution. So do you see it that way, or how does this square with your perception of their music and maybe the genre overall?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I don't condone any of that or any form of violence. And I think especially when the genre was coming to be, a lot of that kind of behavior unjustly got a hall pass, because I think it was like, oh, we're like edgy London boys. Of course we're going to smash bottles, but like, that's not okay. That's not an excuse for anything. So I guess the answer would be, I don't.
Sure. Yeah.
But if I had to, I guess, sort of like step into their heads, not to defend, but to attempt to, I guess, understand it. These are 4 young men who were products of a deeply broken society. They came up from quite difficult backgrounds and were just trying to make a living for themselves amidst an economy that like wasn't really going to do that for them. They were entering the job market in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, which really kind of like had a wider ripple effect. And I think when people get desperate in that way, they can become dangerous. And I think desperation can also be something that blinds you, and it makes you do things and behave. Not that I would know. I'm totally projecting, but
sure.
I think it can make you do things and behave in ways that like you otherwise wouldn't. And so the way they behaved in those instances, obviously completely inexcusable. There's no way to defend violence and hurting people who very kindly paid to go see you. But at the same time, they're very much products of a broken society, a broken London, a broken England that I think has stayed broken for their entire lives. And I think they were young, uneducated, and didn't know how to handle the deep feelings of despair that resulted in propelling them to do something like starting a band.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I mean, it's a interminable conversation, isn't it? Like, this is like, is why we fight, you know, like that book documentary. And I guess what I find interesting is how the role of sort of like the physical aggression at, I guess we could call them more like hardcore shows. Like maybe if a band doesn't necessarily identify with the punk ethos quite so specifically, but like I take, for example, a band like Idols, which I don't think they identify as punk. If I'm remembering correctly, and this conversation is making me understand why they don't do that. But they have that little, you know, yell at you, Joe yelling at you before the show of like, just be nice to everyone, just like take care of each other. Don't, you know, like don't punch anybody in the face, like out of aggression, like love each other and get physical in that way. And I call me corny, but I love that. You know, like I just, it's so interesting to me that you can do both of those things. I guess when is that an idea of the aggressive physical nature of this kind of music that you see widespread, or would you say that is more kind of like in pockets?
I think it is widespread. Anytime I go to a gig, I'm like standing in the back. Like I'm 5'1". I can't go near the front, even if I wanted to, because some giant guy would just like absolutely flatten me. But it's really interesting. You saying that reminds me, a couple months ago, I was at a gig with my husband and he got like seriously injured in a pit. Like I was standing in the back and he came out and he had like blood all over his face.
Shit.
And I was like, someone hurt you, and I got so mad about it. He was like, oh, it's fine. It's just what happens here. And I was like, what? And so just the fact that, like...
That's so hard,
it is so normalized in those environments that, like, he literally went to the doctor to see if he had a broken nose and had blood all over his face, but, like, hey, it's just vibes. I was like, wow, that just goes to show that, like, you said, it does, like, exist as just kind of like part and parcel with like the scene, so to speak, in such a widespread way. And I think it's interesting that, as you said, like it does still happen, even though like bands, I think nowadays are getting quite good at saying like, you know, look out for each other. Like if someone falls, pick them up, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And yet it's still just like kind of taken as like it's going to happen. So yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Who else who are you listening to right now that you feel like is waving the banner of punk in the way that you want them to? Like, what current bands would you say are the standard bearers?
Okay, I think a band that is definitely like what I would refer to as like, I guess like the modern day Sex Pistols, is a band called Bob Villain. If you guys know of them?
No, I don't.
It's a band of two guys. They both go under the stage name. Okay, one is Bob Villain, the other one's Bobby Villain. Neither of their actual real names, of course.
Great.
And they sing a lot of songs about inequality in the UK. And the songs are really good. They're really interesting. They're very like to the point and direct. Yeah. And they've also kind of faced a bit of like, not in the same way the Sex Pistols did, obviously, but like they've been viewed as being like a bit like dangerous, so to speak. Like they're not afraid to call out like festivals or promoters that like they feel like haven't done right by them and stuff. But like people keep coming back. They've only gotten way more popular. They're really good. And
that's great.
I was thinking about this like months ago, and then because I was complaining to my husband, I'm like, oh, who's like whatever. Then I was like, oh, Bob Villain, duh. Like
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're definitely like the ones right now, I think, in that respect.
That's a cool. I mean, they're putting it on the line, right? They're saying like these are our values, like them or not, and you got to respect somebody for kind of like putting it out there, no matter what their values are. Like saying, like I'm going to adhere to this set. I'm going to adhere to this set of principles, and like you can come along with me if you like, but also if you don't, like I'm going to be doing my thing over here, which is good. And I think there's probably a bunch of bands out there that haven't quite cracked the code on how to do that and maintain their success.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's like it's a risk for them with how saturated the landscape is, right? Like people will move on to the next band pretty quick. Is how I feel like it is. Maybe that's not how you're seeing like the actual organic community making around these bands actually bear out.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Because bands are, I don't agree with the way that this should be, but it is the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
Viewed as like disposable because it is so saturated and you can like find someone's replacement online in like a pinch.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is kind of making bands like be more, not self-aware, but like check themselves in that respect more than they would had this not been the way that like our industry has evolved into. And so I think that makes bands like the Sex Pistols, like Bob Dylan, all the more, they feel like treasures, because it is rare that a band is unwilling to simply unapologetically be who they are and represent what they want to represent and convey those beliefs and who they are in the way that they want to, without trying to suck up to like a label, management, agent, etc. I guess it's like people pleasing. And I think when you take that out of art, really beautiful things happen. And I wish that happened more, but it doesn't for understandable reasons. I'm never going to knock a band for wanting to do what they need to do to make a livelihood, especially when that's already so hard
For sure.
to do. But I think that makes bands like Bob Dylan, like the Sex Pistols, etc., feel all the more important and imperative. And I hope that nowadays bands like Bob Dylan, kind of lead the way in showing that like you can say what you want to say and be who you are and operate on your own terms, and the right people will still find you and bolster you.
Hell yeah. Okay. So this has all been very enlightening and enriching in many ways, but we have to decide, Lindsay, whether you have won or lost, which is really at its core. Winning and losing those are our fundamental values. This one goes to 11. Sarcasm. So we're going to now move into the done deliberation phase.
Still no
okay,
sound
Michael.
Still no sound effect. We'll get one soon.
Yeah, we'll get a sound effect. All right, Michael. So this was a heck of a case on so many levels that Lindsay presented. Tell me, what are some of the things that really struck you about Lindsay's case?
You mean besides the fact that she has a mix that has typo negative and the Village People on it simultaneously?
It's a pretty strong pillar of the case, I would say.
I think. I mean, when I asked about the like sort of the origins and where Sex Pistols stand in terms of that, I mean, I thought that was the sort of clearest indication of, to me, why this album is significant, why these artists are significant, and where they sit in like the origins of punk. Yeah. As a genre, keeping in mind the fact that like we are inherently distrustful of genres on this podcast, but like that is, I mean, that to me was sort of where things like really solidified. That was a highlight for me. What about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I think it's the fact that like this is that Lindsay has so clearly like expressed how deep in her bones punk is, like, and just rock in general, which I think you can just feel it. You can just feel that, like, sort of like from the ground up, that connection to it. And I really think in terms of this album in specific, it was that thing about how the Ramones had maybe like released the first quote unquote punk albums the year before, and the Damned had, but this representing sort of like the apotheosis of punk and its ideological underpinnings. Man, that is worthy of a dissertation, I guess, is what I would say. And I hope that you got an A++ on that dissertation. So, do you want to put it to me, or shall I put it to you?
You can put it to me.
Okay, Michael, tell me, as our new friend Lindsay Teske, done what it takes to make the case for the Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols being a perfect album and going to 11?
Oh, yeah. Most definitely. Yeah. It can join the pantheon.
Well done, Lindsay.
Thank you.
You won. Well, this has been. I mean, I have like a million questions to ask you. I guess about living in the UK and just the work you're doing. I think I want to call out also. We didn't mention this before we deliberated, but I also wanted to call out the Band Bible newsletter, if I may. So much of the stuff that you're talking about, I was going through and reading some of the like archived issues of this, and we want to give you a chance to like plug anything you want. We already kind of plugged Hush, but I think I want to plug the Band Bible newsletter for sure, because I think this is an amazing thing that you're doing. Could you tell the people a little bit more about it?
Yeah, definitely. So the Band Bible is a newsletter I started through my company, Carnival of Oddities. And basically it's the tagline is like, let there be light on the business of being in a band. And so what it is it gives artists kind of like a toolkit to begin to make early business decisions about their careers, because obviously a huge issue in our industry now is that artists are expected to come ready-made.
Yeah.
But it's like, how do you even get to that point? Like, so much needs to happen before that can even happen. And it's just ridiculous that like so much already has to be going on for you to even get opportunities. And so I wanted to create a free resource where artists can kind of self-educate on the business side of the music industry. So then when they're at that point where they're maybe like looking for a label, an agent, a manager, what have you, they kind of have an idea of like what to do and how to do it. And so what I do is every issue I interview someone who is making a difference through the work they do with emerging bands. So I've interviewed people who run labels, agents that kind of specialize in like early career artists, bloggers that cover emerging bands. Spoiler alert, Sam is actually September's interviewee. So
yes. More Sam Lopez content.
Yes. And so what I do is I ask those people kind of like, because it's a way to celebrate their career and the work they do too. So I just kind of say like, oh, like, hey, who are you? What do you do? And then I kind of go into like, okay, now what advice do you have for emerging bands who, like, if they're a journalist who want to pitch to a journalist, if they're a label, how to pitch a label, and like, what do you think emerging artists should know? And then at the end, I have everyone leave behind one quote, quote, commandment in the Band Bible, which is like a hard and fast piece of like wisdom or advice they have for emerging bands. And so I do those monthly. I'm thinking of doing them twice monthly, so
nice.
Some more stuff will be coming, just because it's like my favorite thing. Like, I love doing it so much. And so that is on Substack.
You gotta have a Substack. Everybody's got to have a Substack, and I say this genuinely. It's like just fun. I love getting them in my inbox. Like there's only a few I'm subscribed to right now, but there's such amazing. I don't know. It's just. We've been talking a lot about the politics of punk, and like I love how democratic this sort of like newsletter writing thing is. It's like zine, right? It's like zines for us. It's very fun.
Digital zines. I
love it. Michael, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to thank Lindsay for joining us from across the pond.
Yeah.
Glad we could talk to you. Oh, of course. And dear listeners, just a reminder that, we're on the social medias. So if you want to rate and follow us on Spotify or Apple Music, subscribe to us on YouTube, and follow us on Facebook and TikTok, that's where you'll find everything you need to know about the next things happening here. And this one goes to 11 Land.
Our doings, if you will.
Our doings. Yes.
We can't thank you enough for listening. You guys rule. We love you. Talk to you soon.
Bye.